traumatic and those things that are calamitous, and God is able to turn them into something cheerful and praiseworthy.
Yeah.
And so what I'm basically saying to the church on tonight is that it's a blessing to endure some joy.
All right.
We rejoice when there is joy. We get excited when there is peace and when there is splendor. But just like there is praise when things are going well, there should also be praise when things are going bad.
Yeah.
There are smiles and there's laughter when things are on the up and up. But can I tell you that it's a blessing to go through pain? It's a blessing, child of God, to have your share of defeats and devilish circumstances, because perhaps this is God's way of moving and maneuvering you to exactly where God has designed for you to be.
Yeah.
And I know there's at least 3 or 4 people in here tonight with that kind of testimony. I'm talking about some people who can look back over your life.
Yeah.
And you can see that God has a way of using the most strangest and the most painful of situations. To simply direct you into a place of blessing and a place of glory.
All right.
In fact, that's what we find in 1 Samuel chapter 17. By the time we reach this point in the book of 1 Samuel, we encounter a brother who is familiar to Bible readers. We know him as King David.
Yeah.
His story is really amazing, child of God, because David is one who understands the favor of his God. In fact, that's what separates him from the others. Please understand, by this point, David has already been anointed as the king of Israel. But because of disobedience and because of bad choices, the people have not recognized the hand of God that's upon him. And so as a consequence, David is still at the home of his father, and because he is still a son of the house, the Bible lets us know that his father's authority is still what guides him. And that's how David ends up on the battlefield that day. Please don't miss this, child of God. David's brothers are literally engaged in warfare, and it's his father who orders him to go into the location of the battle that he might bring unto them some food for their nourishment. And the Bible says that when David gets there, he overhears that there's a challenge from the enemy. Please understand, this is not just any of their enemies. This is not an average, everyday, ordinary Philistine. The Bible says this is a giant whose name is Goliath. And here is where the story gets interesting, because when David arrives on the scene, he sees his brothers, and when he sees them, it causes him some confusion. It causes him to be shocked, because there's a challenge being thrown out, but David's brothers are not accepting the challenge.
All right.
And so David begins to pose for them the question, who is this uncircumcised giant making all of this noise? To which his brothers, with fear and frustration on their faces, encourages David to just leave it alone, go back to the house, because they understood that, again, Goliath is not a normal Philistine. In fact, to look at Goliath was to simply stare death in the face. But you have to understand King David. King David is not built with hesitation. King David is not built with fear. And so when his brothers push him to go back to the house, it literally does something on the inside of young David. In fact, it could be said that something from within him started to boil over to the point that David accepts the challenge of that giant named Goliath. And this begins to spark some conversation around the town. The Bible says that word gets back to King Saul that young David has accepted the challenge of Goliath. And you know the story. The Bible says that when Saul hears what David has done, Saul decides that he's going to gift unto David some weapons and some armor. But this was not just any kind of armor. This was his personal armor. And so the Bible says that David tries it on, but David quickly realizes that the armor is not made for him. That it's not designed for somebody of his stature. And so he decides that instead of going into battle with Saul's armor and with Saul's weapons, David says that I'm going to do things the way that I've always done them. And you know what he does, church. The Bible says